to know. Okay, welcome everyone. I call this meeting to order and the roll call has been taken by the clerk. This meeting is held in a hybrid format in accordance with the electronic participation policy for virtual meetings. The full corporate policy 50 regarding electronic virtual meetings is available online to review. Staff and delegates participating virtually are reminded to keep their video and microphones off until requested by the chair or members of the committee. All cameras for virtual committee members shall remain on to ensure quorum. Members of the committee shall indicate if they wish to speak by physically raising their hand. Members who are present in person will be given the first opportunity to speak, followed by virtual participants. All members of the committee shall vote by a physical show of hands. Please leave your hand raised until the chair has determined the result of the vote. In the event of a connection or service disruption occurs that affects quorum, we may recess for up to 15 minutes to regain quorum. If quorum is not achieved, the meeting will be adjourned. All rules for delegations under the city's procedural bylaw will continue to apply. So I note that we have bare quorum tonight. So that means if one member leaves, that we will not have quorum and we may have to adjourn the meeting. So I would like to take this opportunity as well to introduce some new and returning members to our committee. We have a former committee member who has now become a councillor, and that's Councillor Sullivan. So welcome. And then we have our new councillor, Councillor Samwell, here as well. I would also note that we have some vacancies, some citizen vacancies for the committee. So if you're interested in those, please check out the city's website and consider applying. I will now move on to item 2, declarations of conflicts of interest. Is there any conflicts for any items listed on the agenda this evening? Seeing none, we'll move on to 3, which are presentations and delegations, which there are none for. So we will move on to items for consideration. The first item, 4.1, is a heritage impact assessment for 246 to 260 Grand River Avenue. The consultant for this assessment was unable to attend this evening, so we'll move into comments for the committee that they would like to move forward to staff. So does any members of the committee have any, well, maybe first, does anyone have any questions about the HIA that they wish to address or ask of staff before we get into comments? I just have one. Patrick, this assessment is for 246 to 260. And so that assessment has to occur on all properties, all structures on the site, as well as the adjacent one.
So through the chair, so this heritage impact assessment was scoped just to the eastern portion of the site, because the heritage impact assessment was required based on the adjacent property there. So we're looking at the new tower on the eastern portion of the site and its impacts on the existing former industrial building. We're not looking at the impacts of the entire development. The western tower is far enough removed. There's an existing tower in the middle of the proposal. So we're not evaluating the existing building, and then the farther building will not have an impact on the adjacent property. So it was scoped.
So 258 was not considered as part of the assessment?
258 was at the semi-detached house at the very end.
Yes.
So that was reviewed through the Heritage Register project. It didn't meet any criteria for listing at that time. So,
okay.
So based on the timing of the circulation, it was scoped to the property that was listed as part of the first phase of the Heritage Register project.
Okay.
That was a practice that we used with the old official plan, because it was based on the inventory and evaluating the property that was being developed. The new official plan speaks to where a property has been evaluated, because we've been working through the Heritage Register project.
So the existing building on the corner of Jameson, I want to say it's Jameson Court, and Grand River Ave is, there is a structure there, but it is not part of this study, or?
Correct.
And there is a site plan that has a building on where that existing structure is. So that is not part of this site plan application?
So the chair, the entire property is subject to the site plan, but because the existing semi-detached building at 258 and 260 Grand River Avenue was evaluated through the Heritage Register and not found to have cultural heritage value, it was scoped out of the Heritage Impact Assessment. The property that triggered the Heritage Impact Assessment was 200 to 220 Grand River Avenue.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Okay, given that, any comments from members of the committee? Member Garner. Trying to be formal.
Just one comment in the recommendations, there should be a change. I can't recall which specific recommendation it was, but it referred to the city of Brampton, not the city of Brantford, so that the consultant should adjust that. It
Okay,
had to do with the recommendation with regard to the incorporating, do you have it?
I don't know what page you're talking about.
Through the chair, would the comment be appropriate to say any references to the city of Brampton should be reviewed and corrected to the city of
That
Brantford as
sounds-
appropriate?
Okay,
That sounds forward.
any other comments from people before we get a motion for the comments to send them on? I have perhaps one as well. I'm gonna give you even better information. At the bottom of page 16 of their report, it has figure 4, which describes it as a newspaper article, which is incorrect. It is taken from Warner and Beers, 1883, which is included in the applicant's reference. Any other comments from anyone? Oh, I see Rob's hand is raised. Go ahead, Rob.
Yes, I would just comment that the recommendations contained in the executive summary of the report are reasonable and should be followed for this project.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Anything else, Rob?
No, that's all.
I think I'll do this then and note that the property at 258 Grand River Ave was owned by the Slingsby family, which is important information to consider.
Through the chair, can you spell Slingsby?
Yes, it is in the report. Slings with an S on the end, BY.
Thank you.
So any other comments before I call for a motion to send our comments forward? Seeing none, I'll ask for a mover. Dan Brown, and seconded by Councillor Sullivan. It still feels weird to say that. Any other comments or questions about the motion as presented? Okay, seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Thank you. I declare that carried. So now we'll move on to item 4.2. I will ask Courtney Boyd to come forward and speak to this item. As a reminder, you have 10 minutes inclusive of questions for the committee.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for having me. My name is
Courtney Boyd. I'm with Watchers Holding Amy Hitchon, and I'm here on behalf of the owners of 93 West Street, being West Chat Holdings. I'm conscious of my time, and I do want to reserve some time for questions if there are any. So I'm just going to provide a brief overview, summary of some of the facts that were contained in Appendix D for tonight's agenda, which was the original notice of intention to demolish. As mentioned, the property is located at 93 West Street. There is a demolition application that has been submitted in August of 2020. Given that the property is listed and not designated on the Heritage Register, it is required that council approve the demolition, which would start first with a recommendation from the Heritage Committee. Some brief facts about the property. As it currently stands, the property is significantly deteriorating. In May of 2021, the property owners did retain J.H. Cahoon Engineering, and they provided an opinion about the property. The summary of that would be that the condition is poor, it's deteriorating at a rapid pace. Since that time, there has been a fire at the property that was caused by unknown trespassers. The property has caused interior and exterior damage. If you do refer to Exhibit D of Exhibit D, you'll see some of the photographs that were taken recently in September that evidence the fire and the damage that's present outside. No photos were taken inside, as it's unsafe to enter the property in its current state. The property is currently listed under 3 criteria. However, the current state of the property has led to the property owners requesting demolition. One of the criteria is the time period, being that it was built prior to incorporation of the city of Brantford. However, the owners would know there is a south addition to the property that was built likely in the 19th century. And it takes up a substantial part of the exterior look of the property. Also, it is said that there was a mayor, William Watt, that did reside at the property, although it's not information present to the owners whether it was during his lifetime or whether it was during his actual service. The third criteria that was noted was that it's a representative of the Italianate style. As mentioned, the building is deteriorating. Many of the features that were present previously have been unfortunately diminished due to the fire, including the eaves-troughs, the fascia, the windows, and the brick. In summary, as mentioned, the owner is seeking a demolition to the building. It's the view of the owner that it represents low material quality. As mentioned in the Heritage Register project recommendations report, a representative style such as the Italianate style, where there's more than 50 properties present in the city, requires that the style is only met if a property is a good representation of that style. Based on the current state of the building, the owner is submitting that it's not a good representation of that style, and actually it does pose a health and safety risk. The building has been vacant since November of 2021 and was previously occupied by tenants. It has been boarded up, although unfortunately trespassers did enter and cause a fire, which has significantly altered the building. It's mentioned in staff's report that the Brantford Fire has confirmed that there is significant ongoing water damage that's also occurring inside the building due to the fire, because it's allowing water to seep in. From the committee, the owner is seeking a recommendation to council to both approve the demolition and also to remove the property from the city's Heritage Register. I'm here for any questions that you may have. Yes, Councilor Sullivan.
One of them, you mentioned that the fire took place after the windows and everything were boarded up. Is there a particular reason why the owner gave up on the building and just boarded it up?
Through the chair, as the building was vacant, that it needed to be boarded up under property standards.
Okay.
So it was boarded up at that time. A fire was caused and it had to be re-boarded up. But as a vacant building, it had to be boarded up in just after November of 2021.
Now, did they by chance even investigate the idea of actually restoring the building?
So through the chair, there was tenants present until November of 2021. So the owners didn't have the opportunity to conduct any significant renovations or even determine whether that would be feasible at that time. It wasn't until the J.H. Cahoon report was received in May of 2021 that it was known that the deterioration was beyond repair. Even if they did want to repair it at that time, the tenants had to be out of the rental unit, and they weren't out until November of 2021. And the second part of your question was whether or not they maybe would fix it following the fire. It's past the point of repair at this point. And if it was to be repaired, the heritage features are mostly lost in any event. It would just be possible replica, but either way, it's beyond that state. It's an unsafe building.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
What are we making room for?
There's no current development proposed.
Okay, just for a second, please. Wait for the chair to acknowledge you and please answer through the chair.
Sorry.
Okay, just procedural. Bev, I saw your hand up and I'll do that before I go to Rob.
How long have the current owners had the building?
Through the chair, and since approximately March 2013, and it has been occupied by tenants since that time until November 2021.
Any other questions, Bev?
No.
Okay, thank you. Rob, go ahead.
Yes, has there been a change in ownership of the property since the original inclusion on the Heritage Registry to the present time?
Through the chair, no, there has not, other than a name change in the corporations.
Did you hear that, Rob?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, before we go to round two, any other questions for first time? Because I have some. So in your report, I'll find it now, and in your letter, at the bottom of page 5 of your letter, you say, quote, "The property owner is identified as the residence of William Watt, who served as mayor from 1882 to 1883. The owner submits that this time frame of William Watt's ownership do not align with this time of mayor," end quote. What proof do you have of that?
We don't have any proof that it's not within that time frame, but we also don't have any proof either, the opposite being that it was within that time frame. I had conducted some research as much as I could and could not find anything specific to that exact period during his service.
Do you know what perjury is?
I wouldn't suggest that this is perjury. This report wasn't submitted under oath. However, it's a submission that was made by the owner that it wasn't during the time frame. And following staff's report, staff has said that it is confirmed that it is associated with a mayor, but not that it has been confirmed with that time frame. Only that the time frame could be over the lifetime of a mayor.
Okay, well, in seeing this and reading this in your report, I did research today at the museum that confirms everything in its entirety. William Watt owned that property. It's also, the edition that you referenced is also on the 1875 Birdseye map. And this book called The History of Brant County, written in the year that he was mayor, identifies him as mayor. And there are city directories from 1867, 1875, 1888, and 1896, saying that William Watt is living at this location.
Okay, I stand to absolutely be corrected, and I thank you for providing me that additional information. At the time of writing this report, that information was not in my possession. And at no point was the purpose of the report to mislead the committee. It was simply to make submissions about the facts present at that time in the hands of the owners.
I would suggest in the future that you do proper historical research before putting something like that in writing. Councillor Sullivan, you have a second round?
Yeah, one more question. the site, so basically what you're saying is that they want to take the site down strictly for health and safety matters. They want to make the area safe. That's why they want it demolished.
There may, through the chair, my apologies, there may or may not be an intention to develop at a later time, but it may or may not be by the owners. At this present time, it is strictly to demolish the building. As mentioned, it is a health and safety.
And to
it's-
remove the heritage factor to the property.
Respectfully, it's not to remove the heritage factor of the property. I would submit that it's beyond repair and the heritage factors have already been deteriorated, at least in part. And it's not, in its present state, it's not feasible to repair. It's significantly charred, including the fascia, which is one of the features I think that we can agree is part of the Italianate representative style. So it's not that it's a seeking to remove the heritage value. It's that the heritage value is no longer present, essentially.
No, just, that's fair enough. Like I said, it was triggered by the simple fact that we want to demolish a building and we don't currently have plans to develop on it. Just seems a little suspicious.
Through the chair, that's completely understandable. Yes, to answer your question, there is a health and safety risk in demolishing. That would be part of that factor.
Okay, thank you.
And I have a couple other questions very quickly based on that. So the water damage that was there was there before the fire happened?
Unfortunately, I could not answer that question.
Okay.
That is I'm sorry to interrupt. That's the information provided by the Brantford Fire that was provided to staff. That the fire is now allowing water to seep into the building.
Okay. And then the char,
Yes.
it's just on the outside, it's on the exterior, you can wipe that off. Or no?
No, respectfully, you wouldn't be able to do that. It is on the interior as well, although as mentioned, I did not enter the interior of the premises. The photos that were contained in my report were taken personally by me. You can see on the outside, the wood, which is underneath the eavesdrop, is completely charred. It's not a factor of wiping it away, it's destroyed. And I can't comment on the brick as I'm not a structural engineer, but I don't think it would be as simple as that in and of itself. As mentioned, Brantford Fire has also commented on the fact that the fire has altered substantially the substantial integrity of the building.
And then the owner of the property, although the corporation has changed hands, has been in place since 2013.
The corporation has not changed hands, it's just the name.
Oh, sorry, the name. Of the
Yes,
corporation.
it is the same owners of the corporation.
So then any deterioration in the property has happened since 2013 is the responsibility of the homeowner. So the homeowner has not kept some of those elements up to its state of repair. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, in part it is fair. So the part that I would agree with is that yes, a homeowner has the obligation to maintain the property. However, it was occupied as tenants, and in order to do such substantial renovations to a property, you do need the tenants to be vacated from the property. And it was an ongoing issue for approximately a year and a half to 2 years, trying to have the tenants vacate the rental unit under the proper legal courses. And that's part of the reason. However, once receiving that the engineering report from J.H. Cahoon, it was determined by the engineer that it was beyond repair.
And the report by the engineer found that there was no structural problems with the property.
Yes, they did find that there were structural problems.
So,
Yes, I will actually point you to.
Yeah.
So if you go to page 2 of my submissions.
Yeah.
I quote the J.H. Cahoon report, which was also annexed as appendix B to the submissions. In the report, and I quote, "In our opinion, the condition of the building is generally poor with deterioration of the structure occurring at a rapid pace."
But that's not the structural integrity.
Yes, if you'll just allow me to continue. just below, at the last bullet point on page 2, we are of the opinion that the structure is not occupiable and is in the process of collapsing at the current time, and we would recommend that the structure be secured until such time as they can be removed. If you turn to page 3, at the top of page 3, there's a quote from the report. Structural stability is in question with the extent of the deterioration of the structure.
But is it the foundation? Is the foundation structurally sound? That's what I'm asking.
I understand. So I can't comment whether it means specifically and only the foundation. It's referring to the building structural integrity. In my understanding is that in its capacity to stand.
We're out of time for our questions, so we'll move on to the staff report. Patrick, go ahead.
So this is the staff presentation for the concurrent notice of intention to demolish and the non-routine demolition control application for 93 West Street. Next slide, please. So the property is a non-designated listed property. It's on the city's heritage register. So that is the function of the heritage register is it acts as a flag on properties when an owner would like to demolish the building. The city is given those requirements. They provide the city with 60 days notice of that intent. There's no other actual protections. There's no heritage permits. There's no design controls on the property. It's simply a flag should there be a demolition proposed. This property was added into 2020, and it was part of the first part of the Heritage Register project. It was a priority group A property for listing. Next slide, please. Just for context, the property is at the corner of Chatham Street and West Street in downtown Brantford. Next slide, please. So again, there are 2 items that will ultimately go before council and the Heritage Committee has an option to comment on. So the first is the notice of intention to demolish a non-designated listed property, and that's a review regarding cultural heritage. Under the Planning Act, the city has adopted a demolition control bylaw. The intent of demolition control under the Planning Act is to prevent against the premature loss of dwelling units. You might see like the loss of assessment in a neighborhood, negative effect to a vacant property in a neighborhood. And that's the intent of demolition control, to try and encourage a new use considered for property. So there are 2 items that are basically being engaged. The committee does comment on both. Generally, the purpose is to advise council if there is a view that the property has cultural heritage value, and then if there's a desire to recommend designation. Next slide, please. So this was just summarized in the report, the notice of intention to demolish that was submitted by Courtney on behalf of her client. So there was a dispute about the applicable criteria being valid. The owner had the opinion the property was of low material integrity. The condition is a health and safety risk. The property has been vacant for some time. That a fire more recent has caused further damage. Next slide, please. So in 2020, as part 1 of the Heritage Register project, the property was found to meet criteria that predated the incorporation of the city of Brantford. So older properties had the potential to reveal more about the history of Brantford, and often could reveal associations with early residents. As was noted, the property was associated with Mayor William Watt, who served from 1882 to 1883, and it was representative of its architectural style. Again, the Italian style is just one of the many that were fairly popular in Brantford at the time. Next slide, please. So the review that ultimately goes to council evaluates both the residential component and the heritage component, and looks at those 2 matters and comes to one recommendation for council. Heritage Committee is always asked to comment on the cultural heritage value. So before a property might be approved for demolition by council, there is a consideration: does it warrant designation? Does it have cultural heritage value? The screening was always properties that were 40 years old. So the two criteria were that it predated the incorporation of the city of Brantford and that it was associated with the mayor. So we have an excerpt here from the 1852 map of Brantford prepared by Marcus Smith. It does have an annotation for William Watt or W.M. Watt. So he is notable enough that his presence was recorded on the map at the time. And this is well before the incorporation of the city. The general footprint of the building is shown. I believe that wing may be is not captured here. But so at the time it was listed, it met these two criteria. Next slide, please. Then we have the architectural style. Again, Italian is a very common style in Brantford. So representative examples hit a lot of the check boxes. So the Heritage Register criteria looked at a variety of sources for the architectural style, summarized them. So homes of the Italian style were generally 2 stories in height and a 3-bay facade. So that's 3 distinct portions, or maybe a 5-bay facade with a bay window. Might have an L-shaped plan. They tend to have very low pitched roofs. Later houses or different style might have a room or an attic, a fully accessible attic. Italian, very shallow, very broad eaves. And oftentimes, or almost always really, the brackets were supported, brackets supported those deep eaves, and they were very ornate cornice brackets. Brick construction was popular, so double brick walls and exterior finish versus, let's say, something like stucco or siding. And then we see tall, narrow, round-headed windows. So again, this is in 2020, acknowledging, the property has recently had the fire, and this shows a slightly better view just of the building prior to the fire. You can see there's some round-headed windows, especially the smaller ones over the front entrance. You see the large paired brackets under the eaves, the shallow roof. And yes, there is the wing. Something we noted in the report, there is another property in Brantford, 477 West Street, also Italian, it's slightly different style in terms of its specific sort of how it displays the Italian attributes. It also had that wing, which in the case of the designated property was a little bit more of a Gothic cottage look. But so alterations do not immediately invalidate the style, but we do, to the register project, looked at the main building, the style it demonstrated. So again, at the time it was listed, the property met those criteria. Now, integrity is one of those technical terms. Staff might dispute the low material integrity as it relates to heritage evaluation. That is, are those original features there? Rather than necessarily, is the building structurally sound? Not that the other definition is invalid, it's a different way it's used technically in heritage evaluation. So despite the fire, the brackets, the wooden eaves, soffits, the cresting on the front entrance, they are there presently. So from an integrity of the heritage attributes, it has integrity. But structurally, this is where the applicant's notice of intention to demolish does shed some light on the conditions inside the building. And that's from 2021. The fire did occur earlier this year in 2020. So next slide, please. So we do see the fire damage to the soffits and the eaves. We see the brackets have been charred, and more so on the front. That would be the the northeast room. We definitely see some soot and fire damage from the flames and smoke exiting the building. Photos from the earlier structural assessment do show the interior. We see damage to the ceiling in the attic spaces. We see rotten wood or other external debris coming through on the floor where it has been sitting for some time. We do see openings to the sky where water will be getting in. The notice of intention to demolish also clearly showed that the eaves were degrading at various locations, and that would have allowed water in. So from a heritage evaluation, are the heritage attributes there? I think staff would still say there was material integrity to the heritage of the building. However, on reading through the assessment and in the notice of intention to demolish, the fire does look to have caused significant damage. It's unclear if soot could be cleaned off without taking all of that material down and examining its actual condition in hand or on a lift. It's hard to really say how much damage that fire had done, but the staff reached out to Brantford Fire, and their opinion was it was a significant fire and it caused significant damage to the building. Next slide, please. So On that basis, on consideration, and that the building has been vacant for some time, it does not appear to have enough structural integrity to warrant designation at this time. And that really is the purpose of listing as a tool. Does a property merit designation? And the engineering assessment raises concerns about the structural integrity of the building. So based on that, staff are not comfortable recommending to council that the property be designated under the Heritage Act. And there has been an attempt to secure it. It's been degrading. Unfortunately, staff will be recommending that the property, the demolition control application be approved, the property not be designated, and in light of its condition, it be removed from the register. So that concludes my presentation and just the overview of the heritage versus the process we review under. I'm happy to answer any questions from the committee.
Any questions for Patrick? Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, Patrick, I have some questions in terms of timeline that I need some help with here. When the property was originally recommended for inclusion on the registry, did the owner oppose the listing at that time?
Through the chair, I'd have to look, but I was not involved with the Heritage Register project at that time. It was under Victoria Code, so my predecessor on the Heritage Register project.
Can you find an answer for?
I can, it's not coming to mind. I know we had a few properties, sorry.
Through the chair of the committee. I also wasn't involved at that time, but I do recall that there were some properties that were removed from the Parkwood Phase A. So there was an opportunity for the owners of those properties to appear before council to request removal. Whether or not this owner did, I don't know.
And again, from my recollection of that and being involved with that project, there was an opportunity for owners to object, of which there were, I believe, 5 in total objections, which do not include this property. Any other questions from you, Rob?
Yes, can you take me to the next step in the timeline, Patrick, following the inclusion of the listing? At what point did the property become vacant?
As was indicated, it was in November 2021. I am aware that the owner had approached city staff about making a demolition application, and that was indicated. Staff gave an overview of the demolition control process at the time. So Victoria Codes was an email correspondence and outlined what we review at the city of Brantford with respect to demolition control, and essentially outlined that further demonstration of the property should be demolished as a non-routine application would be required for staff to support it. So simply requesting a demolition, non-routine demolition application, staff do not support those because it doesn't run with the intent of the program. The intent is to preserve the units until something new has been considered. So there were discussions back and forth. I think a demolition permit form was submitted to the building department, but Victoria was in contact with the owner and their agents, and so that never proceeded. And that's where we are today.
And then finally, if I'm understanding everything correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the building became vacant, was secured, and then a fire followed that.
As I understand it, yes.
And then following the fire has brought us to where we are today, the
Correct. That's my
demolition application. Okay, thank you.
That's it for you, Rob?
Yes.
Thanks. Oh, okay. Yes, we have more in the room. Councillor Sandlin.
Through the chair, I just wanted a point of clarification. Could you tell me if the initial demolition request was before the fire?
To the chair, it was.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Member Garner.
Through the chair, I'd just like to ask Patrick if, I know this is likely beyond your scope of knowledge, but is there anything in the property standards that states the property owner has to maintain a roof on a structure that will be stable and not allow for water to penetrate through into particularly a tenanted building.
Through the chair, that is something I would have to go ask property standards in the building department.
Member Brown?
So after the fire, there was no insurance on the property to fix the roof? Like, is that secure as she pointed out? I know, I know you can't answer.
Through the, yeah, I can't really speculate to that.
I guess my second question is, we're also asking for comments after the questions?
Yes, we will be.
That's-
I have one question for Patrick as well. What was not one of our criteria as well that they were, if they were a business owner or a industry owner? Was that not also an assessment criteria?
Through the chair, yes, there was a criteria about it associated with industry.
Yeah.
I'd have to look at the specific wording, but it was one of them, yes.
So here as well in this biography of William Watt, it notes that he is the contractor and proprietor of the planing mill and lumberyard on Waterloo Street. So just across West Street and then go across to the next street, and that's where the planing mill was. That he was also proprietor of. Any further questions before we get to comments from Patrick? Seeing none, then I'll open it up for comments. I feel like we're gonna have some. Councillor Sullivan, go ahead.
I've got a real concern here about the entire structure is not damaged. There, you can obviously see there's things that could be used. We have a mayor residing in this address 15 years after Confederacy for Canada. This house could have very well been built around the same time frame. And we're gonna lose all of that. I suggest that they find ways of repurposing some of this house that is gonna be demolished. Just so that we can keep the historical value of this mayor present and relevant in the city.
Okay, that's one comment. Any other comments? Member Brown?
I guess this is my own personal comment, but I do think that it's demolition through neglect, through the owner that has owned the property since 2013. They applied for the demolition permit before the fire, so there was definitely intent in the beginning of that before the fire. Out of the 39 houses that I've restored in Brantford, this would seem to be one of the easiest houses that I could restore. So I would hope that if there's no intent to build on the property, then at least try to sell the property. Sell it for what the lot's worth and let somebody fix it up. That's just the comment.
$28,000 according to their assessment.
Yes. Anyway, that's my comment.
Any other comments from you?
No, that's-
No? Comments from other members? Councillor Sandlin.
So I'm very new to comment, but I would just say that I don't feel that it's shown that it can't be repaired and that it would be a shame to lose this historical building without looking into further if there was a way to keep it.
Okay. Any other comments? Rob, I see your hand up.
Yes, I would say, unless it can be proved otherwise, and so far discussion to this point tonight hasn't been able to, the owner, the current owner, who was also the owner at the time of the listing, didn't avail themselves of the opportunity to say that they didn't want their property included on the register. Yet now we're going back in time and trying to say that it doesn't have heritage attributes when it clearly does. And after it was submitted to the same acid test as several hundred other properties that did make it through the heritage register have all had to pass. So you can't go back in time and undo those things just because you want to. And when you didn't avail yourself of the opportunity to originally dispute inclusion on the registry, that it's very difficult to take that back after the fact, when you were given ample opportunity, and you can't undo the heritage of a building and who lived there and what happened there, just because a demolition permit is being applied for. Heritage attributes are what they are, and the history of a property is what it is. You can't take that away and go back in time just because of a demolition permit in the offing. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Member Garner.
I just want to say, this is a substantial structure that was built prior to 1852. And when the owners took over in 2013, it's very clear that they had no regard for the property, because they allowed the roof and the eaves and the fascia all to decay to the point where the home was not properly maintained in any reasonable way to make sure that water wasn't going to penetrate and cause further damage. And so it's very disappointing to see that there's these owners who have obviously no regard for these historic structures.
And then I will add in the assertion that William Watt's ownership does not align with this property is incorrect. Any other comments from any other members? Seeing none, I'll ask for a mover and a seconder of our comments. I see so many hands. Councillor Samwell and Member Brown. Any further discussion on our comments? Would people like to see them maybe on the screen? Can you do that? Because I know we got a bunch here. And it's kind of awkward to remember everything we talked about.
Sorry, just I'm proofreading.
Yeah, that's fine.
Actually, I have another comment.
Oh, okay.
Just after his question about I guess the salvage of the building, if it does get demolished, I know we've talked about this before, that there should be a plan in place that if the demolition permit does get approved and it's either listed or what have you, that salvage should be looked at differently than any other type of demolition. And we have a direct stream of where the brick could go or where anything could go, because it all ends up in some architectural salvage yards around who knows where, sold off. If there's a possibility to keep it in town, would obviously be better than shipping it off somewhere. So I think that's something that we should look in as a group to create some sort of policy of salvage.
So you can say,
That's the major
explore options
yes.
to salvage materials from property.
Because I know I travel across the country looking for salvage to restore my houses, and that's where all this stuff goes. And
Okay, so I'll allow everyone a quick opportunity to look at the comments there, because we have a lot. And if there's any clarification on things, then we can deal with that as well.
That last
EA.
comment
Yes.
is worded, sorry.
Bad. What were you saying? Sorry, I can't hear you.
Comment number 7 recommends the owners explore the opportunities to salvage. and possibly to restore or
Use salvage?
My comment was more of overall, as a committee, we should be looking at what we do with salvage. Not just in this particular case, because there would be a lot of valuable Brantford salvage from this one building.
It's all owners. Is that
Can we say this property or other properties? That way it encompasses, right? If it does come down, that salvage material could potentially be used on other
Oh, for
other
sure.
buildings, not just this one. I think that's what you're trying to get at there.
Oh, yeah.
Wondering if was there any historical footprint that William Watt put on Brantford?
Yeah, it's right here. Have it on. Please, I thought I saw your hand. Did I?
Just maybe in the, what is that, number 2? On the second point, you could also include, because maybe you should stress it, if demolished, this is demolition by neglect. One thing to say it's deteriorated through neglect. Another thing to say that if demolished, it is demolition by neglect. I think this is one of the stronger cases, not the only case in Brantford either. That's it.
Thanks, Lise. I think that's good. If this home is demolished.
This home is demolished.
is
There's 3 other ones.
I think,
subject to is has been,
I think the idea was if the home is demolished, then it is demolition by neglect.
So instead of that,
There
it
needs to be an
just-
if statement in there.
Even if it's not demolished, it's still being demolished as we speak because it's being neglected. If they
Okay.
wait another 10 years, it'll.
Yeah, it will just be worse. Okay, I think we have a good set of comments. If no one has any other corrections on it, then I'll call the vote for our comments. All those in favor? Thank you. I declare that carried. We will move on to 4.3, which is an application to the City of Brantford Heritage Grant Program for 76 Colburn Street. Patrick, you have a report, and I'll ask you to present it now.
Thank you, Chair. So the chair, so this is the to correct the heritage firm to heritage grant, so I apologize, members of the committee. So this is the heritage grant application. There was a heritage permit application in September for this property for the same scope of work. The I guess I'll very next slide. So the property is on the north side of Colburn Street in downtown Brantford. It is designated individually by bylaw 6782 of the City of Brantford. This is Lawyers Hall. Next slide, please. In this location, the property is on the north side of Colburn between King and Queen Streets. Next slide, please. So in September, the applicant came to the city and identified that they had noticed water entry at the northwest corner, which is the rear corner. And at the time, there was a dwelling unit in the basement. There are multiple in the basement. This is the unit at the back corner. And some of the interior finishes were damaged by the water entry. So they removed the finishes, the drywall, and we're looking at the foundation, which they determined to be brick. And heavily deteriorated, sort of waterlogged, damp. So the proposal was to repair the foundation. Now, they came in for the permit. They wanted to apply for the heritage grant as well. And that was the issue they could not apply was they could not procure 2 quotes for the same general scope of work as required by the grant bylaw. So we processed the heritage permit application. It was approved at Brantford Heritage Committee in September, and they used the intervening time to get a second quote for foundation repairs. Next slide, please. So the work in the two quotes would be both the exterior and interior. They have been made aware of the need for a right-of-way permit from the city's traffic section in Public Works. And that's because the exterior work will be done essentially in the city right-of-way. There's a zero lot line. There's no setback between the building and the property line and the city alleyway. Now, it is acknowledged by staff, there are two different approaches to the foundation repair. The original applicant, the quote they had when they made their heritage permit application was going to open up the right of way and from the interior use hydraulic cement, and that would help to prevent water from infiltrating, and they would also do a waterproofing coating. The second quote, Masonry Plus, was procured more recently. Masonry Plus is not relying on hydraulic cement, but would be restoring the foundation wall with historic brick and lime mortar, and then would be putting a waterproofing coating on the exterior. So they would basically remove the damaged brick, restore with like material, like mortar, and then waterproof that. So one approach uses a more modern material that is designed to deal with water infiltration. The second quote is proposing to restore the foundation with like material. Both approaches satisfy the Parks Canada standards and guidelines in terms of retaining what is sound, either restoring with matching material or a suitable modern alternative new strategy that retains the original material that's sound. Both quotes come in at approximately the same eligible costs. I think it's just over $10,000, and then the subtotal pre-tax is $11,000 or $12,000 for Masonry Plus. So despite the different approaches, they're approximately equal quotes. We're into winter. I don't know if they'll be able to start any exterior work, but we did say when they came in for the heritage permit that because it was approved at committee, it could be honored for a separate heritage grant that just didn't come concurrently. Staff is of the opinion that both quotes represent reasonable approaches to restore the structural integrity of that foundation. Without the foundation, the rest of the building will follow at some point. So staff are recommending that the heritage grant be approved. The lowest eligible costs are $10,050. That exceeds the $10,000 required to get the maximum grant of $5,000. So this property would receive the maximum grant. And once the work is done, staff would visit the site, do an inspection, and start the grant issuance process. That concludes the staff presentation. Oh, sorry, I did have two more slides. Yes, just the computation of the grant, and then my staff recommendation is that the grant be approved. I'm happy to answer any questions from the Heritage Committee.
Any questions?
Was there anything about grading on the outside with more like water penetration after the work is done?
So the quotes did say to relay the alley to drain water away. It's city practices that when you're doing work in the right of way, it's public works staff that come and restore the surface to our standards. So that would include sloping the water away from the building. There is a pipe downspout near the back of the building. We do have records of storm sewer lines in the alley. Staff, I did reach out to Public Works and they inspected those sewers. They didn't find a leak in the sewer. But those staff would come and make sure that the alley, once repaved, slopes away from that building.
Any other questions?
Is the applicant made showing which way they're leaning, with which type of restoration they want to do?
Based on the latest quote being provided, I think they might be leaning towards that one. I can't say for sure. They do have to just confirm with the building department the chosen route if it does or does not require a building permit. The old quote, the one that was before the committee with the heritage permit, proposed a reinforcing wall. Building did say that would require an engineer stamp just to make sure it does hold the loads as intended. That was communicated with the applicant, so I think they've been in contact with building since and with right of way staff. And we'll follow up once we report back to the applicant after tonight's meeting and make sure our colleagues in Public Works and building are aware of the file.
Okay. Any other questions for Patrick? just note quickly here. It was interesting, you mentioned in your report there that the property owner discovered water entering and they took the initiative to do that. And you contrast that with the previous issue that we had this evening, and you can see the disparity between approaches. So there is a motion here that we approve this heritage grant. I am seeking a mover and a seconder for that. Councillor Sullivan, and I'll do Rob this time because he's up there. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Thank you. I declare that carried unanimously. Now we'll move on to, I feel like, the meat and potatoes for tonight. Item 4.4, overview of amendments to the Ontario Heritage Act contained in Bill 23, the More Homes Build Faster Act 2022. I'll ask on Patrick to provide an overview of this item and recent developments.
Thank you, Chair. And then for the introduction, next slide, please. So for this item, we are giving you an update and overview of what Bill 23 did to amend the Ontario Heritage Act. Bill 23 was announced and consultation started on October 25th, which is the day after municipal elections were held. The bill amends 9 acts, including the Ontario Heritage Act, and it also introduces a new piece of legislation that applies to the York and Durham regions. So the original comment period for Bill 23 was scheduled to close on November 24th. That was extended to December 9th, so the comment period has not closed. That said, the bill was adopted and received royal assent on November 28th. So the bill is now a law. It is the act, and it is generally enforced in effect with respect to different acts. Most of the amendments in the Ontario Heritage Act are to come into force on a day proclaimed by the Lieutenant Governor. So they are approved, they exist as law, but they are not yet applying, they're not in function. We don't know what the timing is going to be. And we'll cover that again later in the presentation. Next slide, please. I've gone through the amendments to the act. I haven't gone through a line by line, clause by clause. I've tried to group the amendments by a theme. Some of them are miscellaneous, some of them are just implementing. We left those out because they relate to other stuff. The first one is really a miscellaneous amendment. Section 1, subsection 1 introduces all the definitions that are used in the act. At one point, the province added a new subsection 2 that just clarified that the definition of alter excludes the action of demolition. This subsection was never actually proclaimed in force. It was to address something municipalities would do. We actually did it in Brantford. Process demolition of non-important, like detached accessory garage with no heritage value. Process that application without having to delete the heritage bylaw. So if you went through the demolition process until I think about Bill 108, you were obligated as a municipality to delete the designation bylaw if you approved a demolition on an individual property. Many municipalities did not want to do that, understandably, and so the alteration process was used. They wanted to put a stop to that using this subsection, but they also clarified and improved the demolition process. So they never needed to make this subsection actually in force. Now they've just deleted it. So really there has been no change, but it is an amendment we wanted to cover. Next slide, please. Part 3.1, this is the standards and guidelines for provincial heritage property. So where the province or specified provincial agency owns a property with heritage value, these standards apply. So an amendment was added to give the minister, this used to be the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Sport. This portfolio has now moved to a different ministry, the Ministry of Citizenship and Multiculturalism. But it allows that minister to confirm or revise all or part of the evaluation. So the evaluation that determines this property has heritage value can be amended by the minister at their discretion, either all or part of it. And a third amendment was added that allows the Lieutenant Governor and Council to exempt a ministry or other public body from having to comply with the standards and guidelines for provincial heritage properties. And there is a caveat, it's at the lieutenant governor and council, so that's lieutenant governor, the ministers forming the cabinet, believe that it advances one of the listed provincial priorities. Right now, they're listed as transit housing, health and long-term care, other infrastructure, and such priorities that may be prescribed, aka there may be a regulation in the future that adds new items. Again, these are not in force in effect right now. These amendments do not directly affect the city, as we use the Ontario Heritage Act. We're not a body that's listed by the province that has to comply with these particular standards. And again, they're not in force. The questions that arise is, what may happen to provincially owned properties with heritage significance, like the courthouse or other properties that, it may come that either the evaluation is amended or another provincial agency is allowed to carry out work that does not is not consistent with those provincial standards and guidelines. It's not in force. I have not heard anything about this applying to a specific project, but this is just a new authority that has been added to the Heritage Act. So it remains to be seen how it might be used. Next slide, please. This is an overview of the amendments to heritage registers. I know these will be of concern to the committee. I do just want to caveat, and we'll get to this later as well. This report is about the amendments. We're not going into implications on the heritage register project tonight. We will be reporting back, and I will get to that, but I know that is a project that this municipality has been working on for a number of years. We will have a standalone report that allows the committee to provide input into the heritage register project and what these amendments may and how they may impact it. Amendment 4 is fairly straightforward. Right now, there was no explicit requirement the register be available digitally. There was a requirement that it be maintained. Amendment 4 is not really a concern with staff. It does represent a logical step. It was our intent to put the city's heritage register online. It has just with the amount of legislative changes that have been coming through and making sure we get the register project completed on time, we had been deferring the live online standalone register and just using the staff reports with all the properties listed in the interim. So all the properties on the register that are listed could be accessed from the city website. We just hadn't formalized one web page for it. Amendment 5. So in order to list a non-designated property, the property would need to meet a criteria for determining cultural heritage value or interest if such a criteria was prescribed. So the criteria that were discussed by the province are the same criteria that would apply to designation. So if a property was representative of an architectural style, that's the criteria in the Heritage Act right now. In theory, this may limit the ability for some properties to be listed, but I think from a practical standpoint, the concerns are somewhat limited. So the Heritage Act requires that property meet at least one criteria in order to be designated. So if you didn't meet any criteria, the protection of the register was only there until the notice of intention to demolish. If you could not say this property met one criteria, you could not protect it beyond the 60 days notice. So it makes sense that if you say it's going to meet a criteria by designation, you can use that criteria to list it.
Okay, sorry, just for new members for the committee. That criteria is on here, Reg 906.
Yes, and that is in the report. We do have the number there and the criteria. Sorry. So for the city's heritage register project, all our project criteria were based on that regulation. So anything we say in the property information sheets could be folded back and use the explicit criteria in the Heritage Act. We were already doing this, and it was a common practice. So again, you could argue, yes, there's potential that some properties could not be listed where they might be currently, but from a practical standpoint, those properties ultimately could never be protected to the full extent because they didn't meet a criteria. Amendment 6, again, procedurally, so as of July 1st, 2021, any property added after that date, the owner could object to the listing to council. Council has received a number of these objections and so to date has always voted to keep the property on the register. This right did not exist for properties that were already on the register when that new change came into force and effect. So what Amendment 6 does, it just removes that exemption. In the context of Brantford, we had 98 properties predate the ability to object, 458 listed afterwards. So from a practical standpoint, it just extends something we were already exposed to and processing to 100 other property owners. It's not an amendment that I have grave concerns with. It's only being fair to those previously listed property owners. And the intent was always any owner could object at any time because the property might change hands and the new owner may object to the listing. So that rule will still apply. There's no changes to how they function. Their objections to council. There's no ability to appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal. Once council makes a decision, the decision stands. So it is just extending a right that was given to other property owners. It was kind of odd that it didn't apply to everyone. Next slide, please. Amendment 7 is, I think, the one that has been generating the most concerns. As it stands, a property can remain on a register indefinitely when it is listed. Amendment 7 to the Heritage Act would state that non-designated listed properties only remain on the register for 2 years from the date of listing. Anything that was already on the municipality's heritage register that was already listed would count 2 years from when the change is in force and effect. So again, it's not in change yet. After that 2-year period expires, whichever one applies, the property must be removed if certain criteria are met. So to designate a property individually, you issue a notice of intention to designate. Owners can object to the council on the notice. Council can withdraw the notice either at someone's request or of their own motion. So if that happens, the property would automatically have to be removed. If the notice was issued and not withdrawn, but then within a required time period, a bylaw was not passed to designate the property, similarly, the property would have to be removed from the register. And lastly, if the notice has been issued and then a bylaw was passed, and then someone appealed to the Ontario Land Tribunal, and the Ontario Land Tribunal made the decision to repeal the bylaw after having a hearing on the matter, the property would have to be removed from the register. So this does have a rather large impact on the Heritage Register project. The intent was to take a multi-thousand database, the heritage inventory, and whittle it down to the best examples of properties with heritage value in Brantford. Now for those properties to only be protected with a notice of intention demolition for 2 years takes a lot of that work, and the money easily could be argued that for the protection that was given, it's almost like the project is wasted. The rules ultimately changed in the middle of the project. This was intended to be a database that the city monitored for some time. Not that we were never going to designate properties, but it can take a lot of resources to do a designation versus the listing does that preliminary, okay, this does appear to meet criteria. So having done all this work and then the properties to date maybe being protected longer, but maybe only for 2 years, that does really restrict the effectiveness of the Heritage Register as a tool. Heritage registers were also used to signal to other levels of government that the community, the local community had found value in this property. So presently, we cannot designate provincially owned properties, but we can still add them to the register. There actually is an exemption worded into the Heritage Act. You cannot designate a provincial property, but you could list them. And so that would be a signal to the province. The community feels that there's value in this property and would help to have that property evaluated at the provincial level. So that will not be an option anymore, except for those 2 years whenever these amendments come into force. And in fact, it is a bit of a challenge. Next slide, please. So those are the amendments to heritage registers. The next amendment, Amendment 8, was made to the designation of individual properties. So the criteria I mentioned before, actually, sorry, that's not even part of the bill. That's a proposed regulatory change. So at present, if an applicant and owner submits an official plan amendment, a zoning bylaw amendment, or a site or plan of subdivision to the city, and it's deemed complete under the Planning Act, which is one of the statutory steps, the present act would say you can only designate the subject property within 90 days. After that, you cannot issue notice of intention to designate until the matter is closed. That could be upon council passing a bylaw. If the bylaw is appealed or the subdivision approved, then it might be not until the subdivision is dealt with by the tribunal. What the change is, and that could be for any property, but as proposed, councils would only be able to issue that notice of intention to designate the property if it was on the register already. So if it's a non-identified property, it's on the register, someone submits a Planning Act application, the zoning amendment, and the property wasn't flagged, council could not issue that notice of intent for designation. It still needs to be issued within 90 days, but now that notice can only go out for listed properties. Something that was also mentioned, but not part of the bill, because it's a regulation under the act. They were hinting that their proposal be that now instead of only meeting one criteria, you need to meet two. That can be a challenge. Sometimes it's not, but an example that has been actually brought up a number of times by other municipalities and other heritage professionals is either heritage that relates either to lower class at the time. So we tended to designate in the past a lot of mansions, a lot of upper class homes, public buildings, and there wasn't a lot of attention paid to working class homes, post World War II victory housing that was designed for returning soldiers. We also tended not to recognize spaces that were utilized by immigrant communities. They tended not to be high architecture. They tended to be functional. It was what was available. Whether they open up the store and that store becomes, a community hub, that tended not to get recognized. So the challenge there is if you can only use the criteria that it was important to a community, but you can't find a second criteria, that will be heritage that cannot be protected. This is a newer direction in heritage conservation. The recent National Trust Conference in October was considering this as well. That the spaces with that are important to Indigenous communities, there's no architecture, that removes one set of criteria that cannot be utilized. So we had landmark status, contextual status, we had associative value, that this place was associated with the community's values in some way, shape, or form. But without meeting two criteria, we could not protect that property through the Heritage Act. So there are some concerns. Again, some properties may not be affected, others certainly would be. And that restriction on issuing notice, it does make it a challenge to constantly stay on top of what properties may be of interest to the development community, and then proactively, and that was the other intent of the register, to proactively identify the properties with heritage value ahead of the development process to make that part of the conversation. So with this step, the properties we identified could maybe be protected, but again, only for 2 years. And if not designated within 2 years, then they would come off the register and we couldn't apply the demolition process or the designation process after that point for about 5 years. So it is a bit of a challenge. Next slide, please. That was, now we're moving on to here. I should say heritage conservation districts. I do apologize. I copied and pasted a bit. And clearly, I did make some errors, so I apologize to the committee. Changes were made to heritage conservation districts, which are groupings of properties with heritage value. At present, and under provincial guidance, a district like Brant Avenue or downtown Victoria Park Square did not need to meet those Regulation 906 criteria. So you designated properties individually on certain grounds, and whole neighborhoods or areas for with a much broader approach. It was much more contextual. The province is proposing that the criteria in that OREG will now have to be used. It is proposed it's 2 criteria, so it will be challenging to find an entire district, let's say, that has the same landmark status or boundaries you may find suddenly have to change. If we were to look at a property, and this is Amendment 10, not 5, there's no language on how to amend or repeal the Heritage Conservation District bylaws or the plans. Under the new requirement to meet 2 criteria, you may find that if we tried to redesignate Brant Avenue, the district shrinks because only certain properties can meet the criteria. Or perhaps you have like a series of districts to represent. It's really unclear. There's no guidance right now how this is intended to how it's intended to work. If it's a simple majority, 50% plus one of the properties meet 2 criteria, is that enough for a district? It's easy to exclude properties at the fringes, but you might risk a almost Swiss cheese effect if you have to exclude any property that doesn't meet the 2 criteria. So we don't know what the effect would be until we see some guidance from the province. Overall, a process to amend or repeal could be a good thing and provide some guidance. However, it's unclear if these amendments would work like official plan amendments where anyone can request the amendment. It's not city initiated. So again, suddenly you may find that properties get pulled out of the district study through a private amendment. We don't know if that's the intent or what will happen. This is all subject to regulation. When you see the word prescribed, it means there's going to be a separate regulation to discuss this. Those have not been posted. And then the last amendment, which is actually Amendment 11, there are some just typographical corrections. There's an error in the cross-reference, so it's nice to see those corrected. I don't imagine too many concerns from Amendment 11 or 6 on the screen. Again, I apologize for those typos. But yeah, next slide, please. The Heritage Register. So all we can really say at this point in staff is there is almost certainly going to be an impact on the Heritage Register project. But this is not the time to determine it. We do want everyone to potentially come to terms with the changes in the act, understand, maybe think of strategies or what they would like to see the Heritage Register project become if it has to change. So we would report back to council in Q1 2023, that's January, February, or March. We will be consulting the Brantford Heritage Committee on January 30th at the January meeting. We'll have a report to the committee for comments. How does the register project continue? Knowing that we are adding more properties to the list, some of which may only meet 1 criteria, could not be designated. Do we change the formatting of the project, or do we pause the register and examine designation strategies? It's too early to say now. That will be the focus of the January report. Ultimately, though, staff's opinion is that council will need to provide the direction in light of just how many changes have been made to the Heritage Act. It really needs to be a direction to staff and the committee from council. So the feedback from the committee will go into a staff report. It will make its way to council. Council will have a direction. But again, for the time being, most of these amendments are not forced. What's unclear is when that will occur. There's some language that in the posting online the province is consulting through, and that link is available in the report. If the proposed More Homes Built Faster Act 2022 is passed and the regulatory proposals approved, and that's the part we're unsure about, the Ministry of Citizenship and Multiculturalism intends on bringing the legislative and regulatory amendments into force on January 1st, 2023, unless otherwise noted. All of the amendments in the legislation that passed were otherwise noted and said on a day to be proclaimed. So it's unclear if that's what they're commenting on, or if they mean, the rest of the bill goes ahead, but this stuff will generally change. And that's a hint that it will be January 1st, 2023. It's unclear if they will consult on the regulations they propose, or if they're using the existing posting as that opportunity. So the consultation stops on December 9th. There's that information is not clear, at least as far as my read of the posting. I believe that was the second to last slide, and the last slide is the recommendation. Yes. So because this is an information report, the recommendation from staff to the committee is that it be received, and we will be reporting back with a report seeking comments and allowing that discussion about the Heritage Register. That will be in January. So if there are any questions about the amendments as we understand them, and again, based on only what has been passed by the legislature to date, we can provide some information, but a lot of it is outside the city's hands and with the province. That concludes my presentation.
Okay, tons of information, and I'm sure there's tons of questions too. Who wants to go first? Questions? Oh, Rob, I see your hand. You're the first one up, and no one in the room has jumped ahead, so go ahead.
Yes, Patrick, just going back to the first part of your report, I believe you mentioned the date of October 25th when this legislation was initially circulated, and you made the comment that consultation happened at that point. What consultation did happen, was offered by the province?
So through the chair, when the province proposes a new bill, there may be exceptions for the budget, but I would have to defer to the legislature or their clerk staff. But generally, when they propose a new bill, they post an entry on the Environmental Registry of Ontario, and sort of like a web listing of all the matters they consult on, whether it's new acts, if it's severances, like, again, creating new lots in areas without municipal governance. But that was the consultation, the ERO posting, that's 019-6196, the link in the report. That was the start of the consultation that I'm aware of with respect to the Heritage Act. So it was open for people to read the proposal, the draft language in the bill, while it worked its way through the legislature and committees of the legislature. And so members of the public can provide written comments by submitting them to that posting until December 9th.
Does that answer your
Okay.
question, Rob?
Yeah, I'm having personal difficulty with and feeling conflicted between the concept of consultation and providing comments, because I don't believe they're the same thing. No one came to this committee, a heritage committee, amongst other heritage committees across the province, and actually consulted us, who is actually doing the work on behalf of the province in the local community on what we thought or explained what they proposed to do. So I know they're using the word consultation, but I have a lot of difficulty with how that plays out practically. Thank you.
Okay, no other questions from you, Rob? Or at least not right now?
Not at this time, no.
Okay. Okay, Bev, you go ahead. Launch into your suite of questions.
It's not a question, it's just, I'm being a bit flippant here, but as a solution to these proposed amendments, I say that the city just create a form, we push through the designation on the 98 properties. There'll be numerous complaints, and in theory, they all would have to go to the land tribunal. If everybody approached it that way, there'd be a firestorm at the tribunal, and the province would have to figure it out. But on a more serious level, I'd say that the committee should give thought to our most treasured and important heritage buildings that we do want to ensure get designated sooner rather than later, so that we don't lose any others.
And through the chair, if I could just offer, and that is exactly something that can be discussed at the next report. That is the discussion of that kind is certainly appropriate in January when we bring back the next report.
Alan, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, through the chair, and just to build on what Patrick had said. Yeah, we don't have the answer here tonight as to what are we going to do with the register. That's the big question in the group, of course. But we'll be coming back to you to have that discussion. Tonight, really, we just wanted to acknowledge Bill 23, these changes to the Ontario Heritage Act, knowing that, it's been in the news, because I've probably heard of it. We changes are coming, we've got to figure out how we're gonna deal with it. Because really, I mean, all of the time and effort that, you know, staff and our consultants in this committee have all put into the register, you know, it's all kind of being brushed away. So what are we gonna do? Almost looks like the purpose of a heritage register due to these changes is really just to create some sort of staging ground for properties that you may want to designate. So our solution is, yeah, Bevel's getting to that. We're gonna have to kind of prioritize those properties that we may want to see designated. Those will be the ones that will be highlighted on the list or kept on the list. But given that they would then need to come off 2 years following, you would need to kind of work into some sort of work program that you would get them designated. I mean, then we're going to have to think about our capacity in terms of some research work that needs to go involved in that process. How much can we actually do? Those are the kind of things we'll be thinking about. So that's what we think as well. And then we can have that discussion about some options and we'll recommend to council in terms of what we do for this project.
Especially if it's only listed, if they are listed, it's only for 2 years, and then if they have to come off for 5 years, then maybe we need a mass designation of every house that's listed just to have them designated rather than being listed.
Well, again, challenge through the chair. Apologies for interrupting.
Yeah.
For limiting it. But it really is at how do you then proceed? And that picking and choosing of either what to prioritize or what to solicit property owners for their interest. That's the hard part. We really won't, like, ultimately, we won't know what the project looks like without those regulations. So we can, municipalities can proceed with designation right now with creating heritage conservation districts, but to start that work, we will always be running the risk that an amendment is proclaimed in force. And suddenly the research that was done or was just short of getting the council for ratification, you know, like hoping for ratification, suddenly, oh, you need 2 criteria for a district. Well, what does that do to the boundaries you established and did all the work for it? So that's the other part of it, is just acknowledging how far can we go and what happens, you know, if the rules change again in the middle of the process. That we could designate a property on one criteria right now, and we don't need to meet a criteria to list it. So we've been doing that again to ensure the properties move forward. Well, what happens to those properties only meet one criteria? Either a lot more research is done, or there's a risk of the call saying those properties do not get evaluated further, no matter how exceptional their integrity is, their quality, their architectural style, unless something else can be found. You know, there's no explicit organization that sits there and critiques a designation bylaw, but we do provide them the Heritage Trust. You know, we cannot speak for the Heritage Trust's direction from the province. So a municipality could try passing a designation bylaw, but it's entirely possible it would be thrown out on appeal and possibly flagged to the province, the Ministry of Private Trust. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, we think this one criteria is really worth it. That really leaves you open to that bylaw just being thrown out entirely. So, or with districts, again, this small group of properties meets the 2 criteria that are required that we say the district has, but 75% of it meets one or the other, or is not as strong a candidate. Again, without that guidance, you could find that going down that road, the rug does get pulled out from underneath us a little bit. So that's where the challenge lies. We may know as of January 1st, we may see that on December 12th, January 1st is proclaimed, because that's the Monday after discussion closes on our commenting period closes. Anything is speculation at this point at best. So,
Any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna try and get through some that I have. So amendment 2. So the minister can unilaterally rewrite our evaluation of heritage interest on their own.
That's my understanding through the chair.
Okay. And the lieutenant governor and council can also then they can unilaterally make a decision that designated heritage property now needs to be the center for a transit hub, so we can demolish a designated heritage property because it fits within one of those priorities. Am I understanding properly?
That's my understanding.
Perfect.
Again, without, seeing how this will function, or without experience and what's happened, it's hard to say.
And then you mentioned about we can't designate provincially owned properties. But how does that work with heritage conservation districts? Because we have the Victoria Park Heritage Conservation District, which includes a provincially owned property.
Through the chair, I'd have to go look back at the act in 1990 to see if it had that same prohibition, or that might have been added later on. I don't know.
But that doesn't apply retroactively.
It may be a case that because it was the district was there, maybe the property is captured that way, and a new district or a new designation, we couldn't, if there was no district, we could not today go designate that the courthouse. But I would need to go back to the act in 1990, just before the district was passed, to really comment.
Okay. There was more. Your comment about them needing to meet more than one property. So Wayne Gretzky's house only meets one criteria. It is only known as the birthplace and growing up home of Wayne Gretzky. So that one could get removed by the property owner.
So
They
through the
wanted
chair,
to?
it's already designated, so they would have to apply to council. Council would have to repeal the bylaw. If they attempted to demolish, council could deny the demolition, but they can appeal the decisions under the Heritage Act, but it's already designated. So my understanding is the property doesn't lose the designation. We just have to see if there's any transitional rules about once designated, does it need to meet the new standards, like the new threshold, or just the new format, because the format changed previously. But as it stands, it's not for architectural reasons, it's purely associated value. You could argue, yes, it only meets one criteria.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of my concern too with the bill is the degree of retroactivity, because it seems to imply retroactivity with everything. There were more. Just going through the list of amendments. Yeah. So it's almost amendment number 7 almost makes it seem like we are on that 2-year timeline. So if we were to go forward, we would have to, I guess, consider or keep that in mind if we're going to add additional properties. Then essentially we want to ensure that we're going to be designating them in the future. So we also kind of need to make sure that, again, the workload is appropriate. So if we're adding 50 properties onto the register, you're not going to be able to do 50 designations within 2 years. That's moderately unreasonable, right?
And through the chair, the challenge would be the research. Properties listed on architectural grounds may be easier to do that work. We started classifying them through the register project. We have guidebooks on different styles and what is typical, but it's doing the property level research, like going into old mapping, going into city directories, which again, if one is issued every year, you have to develop a methodology for checking like almost a sample, let's say every 5 or 10 years. And when you see a change, you go back and fill in the missing piece, and that can take a lot of time. So it's the contextual value, the associated value that would present the biggest challenge to, yes, designating properties within 2 years, sort of at a massive scale.
through the chair, we're gonna have to prioritize. So probably look to, phase A, part one of the Heritage Register project was priority projects citywide. So presumably that's where we'll find what the priority projects or properties that we want to look further to designate. But yeah, we'll still need to kind of reevaluate that list just to see which ones may or may not have more than one criteria. Because some of the ones that may have just one.
And then I guess a request for our January meeting when we have this report. Can we get a summary of all the money that we have invested in this project since its inception and to date, including money spent on consultants and staff time?
Through the chair, we could look at the project budget, include that in the future report.
Does that include all costs though?
It could be harder to track specific staff time associated with the project, but certainly from a budget line, we can easily track that.
My initial response was we should have a number of that. And my initial response would be to sue the province for wasting our taxpayer dollars on a project that we decided was appropriate for our community and within our legal rights and our legal means to do. And the province has now changed the rules in the middle of our project twice, negatively impacting things. I'm leaning towards that's probably not the most effective use, but I also think once we have identified a strategy and a process going forward, I think we should potentially consider advocating to council to write a letter to the ministry or minister regarding the impacts that this has had on our project as well. Those are some of the other strategies that I've thought of. Any other questions for Patrick? And okay, I see more hands on the screen. Lise, you want to go since you haven't had a go yet?
So a question, a clarification maybe. One, do we know exactly how many heritage advisory committees there are in Ontario? And it's not just Brantford that wasn't consulted, right? Like no committee was consulted. Like it's one thing to say the public can go and comment, but you have these mandatory, like mandated heritage committees that have been around forever, that aren't being consulted at all. I just wanted to make clear that it's not just Brantford then, right? Like no one's been consulted on this at all. Like we didn't happen to get missed or something.
Through the chair, my understanding is that the province made the posting on the environmental registry, and it is up to the public or councils through like voting as a body and passing a resolution to provide those comments. It's not sort of like a planning act application where you would get circulated. So.
Anything else, Lisa, on that or? No? Okay, Rob, you have some follow-ups?
Yeah, the meeting that's planned for January 30th, is it? Where the report would come back with the impacts on the Heritage Register project. I feel this is a huge topic that affects so much of what we do, not just with the Heritage Register project, but with conservation districts and designations in general. It's so much of what we do, really. Could it be the only agenda item for the meeting? because there's going to be so much to talk about.
Sure, that might be a question for the clerk. I mean, ultimately, from our workload perspective, if we receive heritage permit applications, heritage grant applications, we take them to the next possible meeting. If you want it to be the only item, I think.
Yeah, so through the chair, I would leave it to the staff liaison to decide if there were items that needed to come based on their timeliness. If it was feasible for us to have that be the only item come, that's certainly something we could facilitate. If there were items that need to be timely, perhaps it would be appropriate to have a meeting at the call of the chair. The chair and I could discuss what that date would look like. Keeping in mind, January and February are meeting heavy for the municipality because we have our estimates and budget committee running. So like our council members would not be likely available to come to Heritage Committee just because they probably want to be in the budgets and estimates committee process. But we can certainly try and find a date to be able to do that. It just will take a little bit of work to do that. It may not be like right around the same time frame as the scheduled January 30th meeting.
Right. I just think that there's so much riding on this that it would be difficult to have an adequate discussion to sort this out while trying to do other items at the same time, whether that needs to be a special meeting called by the chair at a different date or what have you. I just wanted to express that if we try and encompass this in with a bunch of other agenda items, we may not have an adequate discussion on what we need to be talking about.
I will, I'll work with Patrick and the clerk on that. We'll have a better, we don't have a perfect answer now about how many applications are coming forward. But, probably by the new year, we'll have a better idea. If we know that we're going to have a loaded agenda on that January 30th night, then we will look into the possibility of having a meeting just for this.
That's fair. And regardless, it's going to be after January 1st anyhow, which is the target date for the legislation. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. I just wanted, because people have brought it up and I forgot to comment on it. The consultation piece with people, I hear that and I think that it is quite valid. However, I believe that the premier and his staff were very adept. They knew that they wanted to do this. They proposed it the day after a municipal election in which municipal councillors were not going to be around and sworn in to have wholesome debates about this. Heritage committees would not have been reformed and reconstituted after the municipal election. And I am of the opinion that this was done solely to stop due proper consultation from members of the public, councils, and heritage committees as a whole. Dan, you had something else? Or you want to see the floor to Bev? Okay, Bev, go ahead.
Just through the chair, and I want to make the point that the requirement for a city to maintain a heritage registry has been within the act for a very long period of time. And the city of Brantford was very slow to ensure that we had this registry. And it's rather unfortunate that now that the city is more willing to appreciate our heritage, that we finally undertook the efforts to create the registry. So it's not, what am I trying to say? Just that we've been slow and it's really unfortunate that at this time, we're very clear that heritage is important, and it's kind of being cut out from under us through this legislation.
Okay. No, you don't have anything else? I'm just going to add here because I am in the know. The county of Brant, when I started on this committee, at my very first meeting, we lost a structure, which I thought we didn't need to lose. And Ruth Leffler came for a visit, and she told me, "Oh, you need to do what we're doing in the county. We've been starting on a heritage register. We've been working on it for 10 years." That was in 2016. In December of 2019, I met with planning staff from the county of Brant who said that their heritage register project was coming forward, and they wanted me to look over their project to make sure that it fit with the guidelines. And I told them that it did, and they said that they were going forward with it in spring of 2020. And so we have been working on it for much shorter than the county of Brant. We have achieved much more than the county of Brant, and the county of Brant has all the work done, and they are now paying the price of inaction. And they've had more time than we've had, and we've come much, much farther than they have in this process. So I hear what you're saying, that we're behind, but in some ways we definitely got there ahead of other people as well.
So I'm also on the Heritage Committee for Brant County, and we talk about the registry hardly ever compared to the way that we do here. I think that we are, like you said, we're further ahead than they are. Not if that matters or not, but maybe come January 1st, it might mean more to us than to them because we are further ahead.
Okay, any last questions for Patrick before we move on? Okay, thanks everyone for providing your insights and feedback and questions. I think that's helpful. And I'm definitely looking forward to our January meeting where we can discuss this in more detail and have perhaps a better strategy in place, having more information in our hands. We'll now move on to consent items.
Through the chair, if we can
Oh, sorry.
actually.
Oh, yes,
go
we
to the
need a
motion.
motion. There was a motion that we talked about a long time ago when Patrick finished giving his report, that this report be received. So I'm looking for a mover, Member Brown and Councillor Samuel. And any questions on receiving the report? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Thank you. I declare that carried unanimously. Okay, moving on to item 5, our consent items. We have the Heritage Committee minutes from our September meeting. Anyone wish to move approval of the minutes? You were there, so you can. Moved by Councillor Sullivan, seconded by Lise. Any errors or omissions, things that need to be corrected with the minutes? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor for approval of the minutes? Thank you. I declare that carried unanimously. There are no subcommittee updates currently. We used to have a number of subcommittees, and now that the election has happened, we may have a discussion around some of those subcommittees and the work that they do. There are no resolutions and no notices of motion, so I would ask for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Sullivan, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for a great meeting, and we'll see you in January.
Stay safe, be well, everyone.